Whenever we create a character, we need to have some idea of who they are, where they come from, and what has formed the person that they are now. Understanding the depth and background of a character is important for informing us how they will behave, the attitude they'll have, and the skills that they can utilize. This allows us to write them realistically, and in a way that our reader can believe such a person would navigate the journey ahead of them. While it's important for us as a writer to know these qualities and communicate a certain number of them to our reader, we want to be careful about deconstructing people too much. Character deconstruction has become a bit of a fad in recent years, and initially came from a relatively reasonable starting position. That is, writers wanted to explore archetypical characters in more depth, to have a firmer understanding of who they are, their flaws and issues, in order to seemingly create a more balanced and nuanced character. On the surface, there isn't anything immediately wrong with this. Audiences are more likely to engage with somebody who they know more about, can sympathize with, or share some flaws and background situations. But as I'll show you in this video, we do need to be careful when breaking down our characters too much, and we need to understand how it could damage the entertainment factor of our story. Let's define what we're talking about quickly. Simply, deconstruction is where we take a more intimate view of a character, either to examine beyond surface features, to artistically push the boundaries of traditional storytelling, or to find opportunities for character growth. We can challenge archetypical representations of certain positions or figures in order to provide a more holistic view of a role or particular place. This provides great openings for writers to subvert some expectations, write unpredictably, and push back against common assumptions that people make, as well as avoiding cliches. There's nothing inherently wrong with this in principle, but we should be careful before plunging in, as doing so can badly damage our characters far more than doing nothing at all. Firstly, deeper characters that have every facet of their personality exposed aren't always more engaging as we may assume. Sometimes we should leave things up to the imagination of our audience, to let them make judgments or assumptions so that they can have more investment in the character that they are journeying with. Yes, it can make us more sympathetic to them, but deconstruction rarely reveals positive traits and has been exclusively used to demean or belittle characters by undermining their good qualities with a ton of negative history. I don't mean that in a nasty way, but quite often the negative revelation will undermine any good features or thoughts that we have about a character. Logan is a great example of good character deconstruction, but the film isn't exactly cheery and uplifting, and treads a fine line between exploring and exploiting the character. Opening the scars of Logan's flaws and history is interesting, but there are consequences too, the main one being that some people felt it undermined what made the character so compelling in the first place. That is to say, sometimes simple archetypes are useful. They are cleaner and allow us to focus more on the story rather than spending pages or hours breaking down each constituent element. We can focus on storytelling rather than a counseling session. For entertainment, we often don't need to break down every character into every dirty little detail. Many audiences prefer more straightforward characters who are easy to understand and without too much nuance, and then have the freedom to make their own decisions on what formed them. This doesn't mean that we should create one-dimensional actors who have nothing beyond the stereotypical, but it also means we shouldn't make characters who are so complicated that they alienate our audiences and clash with the theme of the story we're trying to tell or historical perceptions of that character. We don't need to know every element of Ripley's personality and history for us to enjoy Alien, because it's a sci-fi action horror film, not a biopic. Examining her piece by piece would detract from what we're trying to do in the film, which is to entertain. It may seem counterintuitive, but not showing all your cards is by far a better marker of good writing, showing that restraint rather than just blurting out every scrap of detail. This is the error that the Alien films made as they progressed, and more about Ripley was revealed. Her heroism and power was severely undermined because of this, as her simple, archetypical, roughneck badass character that we understood and could get behind made way to a cloned superhero with memory loss and motherhood issues. This is not a good trade-off because it's not what our audience wants, and they're the ones who are going to buy our book or watch our film, so it may be worth listening to them. To reinforce the simplicity point, some of the best and most memorable characters ever made are the ones with obscure or vague backstories who occupy deeper, mythological and archetypical roles within the story that almost all people in all cultures can connect with. There's a reason Voldemort, Darth Vader, Hans Landa, Cruella de Vil, and Sauron regularly top the best villains of all time list, because they are decidedly simple and are there to serve a purpose in the story. We don't need to know every inch of their childhood trauma or every individual prejudice and flaw in their personality to know they're the villain of the piece. Their simplicity is what makes them more intimidating. Their mystery makes our heroes' efforts more rewarding, and our reader can engage with the story instead of being bogged down in unpacking the villain each and every time. The same goes for heroes like Ripley, as mentioned, or Frodo, Bilbo, Leia, Trinity, or Eowyn. Following them on the journey rather than diving into their backstory is far more compelling, and allows them to serve more focused, defined, and easy to connect with roles. Where series like The Rings of Power or films like The Dial of Destiny really fell flat with many long-time fans of the franchises is where they moved so far away from the established characters of Galadriel, Sauron, and Indy that the audience could no longer connect with them. People were alienated by seeing their beloved characters changed beyond recognition and seemingly without reason, pulled apart in a seemingly disrespectful manner or to aid ideological ends, and were then expected to act if it was fine. It can be tempting, and many modern films have fallen into this trap, especially when writing male characters, to reduce your actors in the name of depth or exploration, but all you end up doing is turning off audience who want to see Indiana Jones crack his whip, not be depressed and drink alone. Sometimes the archetype and the simple character is much better for the story, and we can focus on who they could be, rather than on who they were. This obviously isn't always the case. When we watch Oppenheimer, it's more important that we understand his nuances, because this is very much a character-focused story, and who he is forms the core part of the narrative. Hannibal Lecter needs to be opened up so we can get a deeper view into the mind of a serial killer, and Elizabeth Bennet's backgrounds, thoughts, and feelings are integral to what makes Pride and Prejudice a compelling story. But you do need to choose what you're trying to do with your story before you decide how deep into the character you need to go. This leads us on to another point, which is that deconstruction has become a bit of a cliché unto itself. How many orphans have we met, or people with an alcohol problem? How many fallen heroes are there now? How many aging figures needing to be propped up by perfect new characters? That's not to demean these qualities. They can certainly exist and people struggle with them as part of their life, but we risk trivializing these issues and removing the complexity that real people suffer from, in favor of trying to make more complicated fictional characters. Instead, it becomes tired and stale when all characters are deconstructed in the same way. If you're going to deconstruct to any degree, try to make it fresh and original. The reason Logan works so well is because the struggle he's facing is the loss of his immortality, his inability to cope with it in a way that most people would, such as drinking, and the persistent anger issues that had fueled him before now acting to his detriment. This is a unique set of character flaws that affect a unique individual, and it's therefore quite interesting to see a superhero deal with, as it challenges the archetype of functioning and heroic figures that we're used to. Homelander in The Boys is treated in the same way, with his Oedipus complex and ego, as well as the dawning of his individual might feeding said ego. This is an intriguing and terrifying combination that compels us to keep watching, because we've never had our assumptions challenged about such a figure in this way before, and we very rarely learn about the cruelty that a superhero could produce, or where that comes from. Pair this with Starlight's journey of resisting the darker elements of her personality and using her past to help her harness the good, and we have a unique and interesting spin on deconstruction that doesn't get excessive. But again, not every character needs this treatment. Not everybody has a tragic backstory that is ripe for exploration, or exploitation, depending on who you ask. Sometimes who people are is on the surface already, and that's okay. We are writers, not psychologists, and not every scrap of information in a character's history is relevant or needing to be dredged up. Sometimes we can have a great, interesting, and engaging character without breaking them down. Sometimes the best stories are produced by simple people doing remarkable and marvelous things, and that lack of complexity works so much more to the credit of the story and the character's agency. In A Game of Thrones, many of the characters are reasonably simple to understand, but also gripping and enjoyable without us going into every minute detail of their life. Catelyn Stark is noble and honourable, and though we learn a little about her past, we know who she is, and her fate is no less dramatic for her not being fully explored. In fact, because we haven't delved so deeply, it makes her end all the more tragic, as we've now lost the opportunity to learn more about her and must depend on the words of others. Similarly, Tywin Lannister receives almost no deconstruction beyond basic traits and biography, but is one of the most interesting and intimidating characters in the show. Who he is clear to us, from our first meeting, by his actions and words, not by his history or individual flaws or any heart-to-heart conversations where he is exposed. As the show progresses, more cracks are revealed about him, but we don't spend hours exploring every single psychological avenue on how he came to be manifested. It is better to have strong characters now, where who they are is clear, rather than weak characters who we have to break apart in order to make them be interesting. Continuing with Game of Thrones is where we find another issue with character deconstruction. Jaime's exhumation was a thoroughly compelling exploration of character and a textbook example of deconstruction done well in a similar vein to Logan. He was humbled and opened up just enough that we realize he is more complicated than a baddie, and we have some sympathy with him for that. This was paired excellently with Brienne, who opened up to him in turn and revealed her own flaws, making their partnership intriguing and unique. This was further contrasted well with the refusal of Cersei to have any deconstruction, which served as a great method of showing us how the twins had moved apart. That is, until the end where all that work was undone and the victim of a very weak payoff. The deconstruction was completely undermined, and the ending would have been better had it not happened at all. That's because if you're going to use deconstruction for highlighting character growth, then you need to make sure the character actually does grow and change. Saying, here are all the problems or hidden virtues, and then doing absolutely nothing with them at the end, as is the case in many modern films where many traditional characters have been ripped open and then abandoned, is very weak writing, and leaves a very sour taste in the mouth of your audience. When you pull characters off their simple but engaging pedestals to be ripped apart, then you better have a very good plan of what you're going to do with that. It's simply not enough to abandon them or make all the work useless. It's a waste of your time, and your audience's as well as a massive loss of potential and agency. Deconstruction is not enough by itself. Characters must be reconstructed if you pull them apart. It's why many more classic characters stick with us, because we're much more focused on their journey than their past and flaws, and the modern fad of deconstruction hadn't taken hold yet. Any flaws should just become apparent as people fail to meet or overcome challenges, not just for the sake of making characters more complicated. Now, all of this isn't to say that you can't open up your characters. Of course you can, and maybe you should. Jaime's journey is only compelling because he talks about his flaws and past. Daenerys only interests us because we know some of her flaws and her historical motivation. Logan is exemplary precisely because it does deconstruct an established character. But what they all did at their height was explore them with respect. The writers didn't rip these characters to pieces because they hated them. Quite the opposite. The writers loved these characters and wanted them to be stronger and motivated as well as moving the story forward. They wanted them to be more nuanced and sympathetic, not to be weakened to make other characters appear stronger or to serve other ends, but to make the characters themselves and their achievements greater as a result of their shortcomings. If you're deconstructing for ideological reasons, as is clear in the cases of Indiana Jones, Luke Skywalker, Ellen Ripley, or Galadriel, you're doing something wrong. You should be deconstructing for narrative or character growth reasons. That's it. It's that simple. So the next time you're tempted to explore your character's history or biography, just remember Occam's razor, that often simple characters are better than super complicated ones, that not every character needs to be pulled open, and that doing so can actually alienate large swaths of your potential audience, and that often it is better to let your audience decide how they feel about the characters themselves, rather than you dictating to them with deconstruction. Instead, empower your characters, have them act and speak how you think they would, and leave the bulk of their past to inference. This will make your story much more enjoyable, and the journey for your reader will be much more interesting, and this will be much more rewarding for you as a writer.